From Mike Tyson saying Don King is not doing well, to Larry Holmes joking about him in recent interviews, the tone around King has clearly shifted. But wait till you see what comes up next. Because recent photos of King's Florida estate show a cluttered space that looks frozen in time, hinting at how much has changed around him. Donald King was born on August 20th, 1931 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was the fifth of 6 children born to Clarence and Hattie King, and his father worked at the Otis Steel plant, where he was killed in a workplace accident in 1941, when a ladle exploded and engulfed him in molten steel. Don was 10 years old. His mother, Hattie, received $10,000 in compensation and relocated the family to the middle-class Mount Pleasant neighborhood. That amount, roughly equivalent to $218,000 today, was supposed to be the price of a man's life, and it was all the King family was given to start over. Hattie King made a living however she could. She sold peanuts and homemade pies and used a local policy house disguised as a concession stand to run a numbers game, a form of illegal street lottery that Don and his older brothers all eventually became involved in. That world of underground gambling would shape the trajectory of Don King's entire life, because it taught him something he would carry into every boardroom, every contract negotiation, and every closed-door deal he would ever conduct: how to count money, how to hide money, and how to make sure the house always wins. To finance his college education, King became a numbers runner, a courier of illegal betting slips, and within a short time became one of the leading racketeers in Cleveland. He attended Western Reserve University for a year, but dropped out to concentrate on his numbers business. By his early 20s, he was known on the streets of Cleveland by a different name, Cadillac Slim. By the 1950s, he had complex systems in place that made him the most successful numbers banker in Cleveland, and he ran a nightclub alongside his gambling operations. He was making money, real money, in a world where violence was the cost of doing business, and twice that violence would cost someone their life. In 1954, Don King spotted a man named Hillary Brown attempting to rob one of his gambling houses. King shot Brown in the back, and the incident was ruled a justifiable homicide. No charges stuck. King walked free. He went right back to running his numbers operation as though nothing had happened. The streets of Cleveland understood what that meant. Cross Don King, and there will be consequences. 12 years passed. On April 20th, 1966, King killed an employee, 34-year-old Sam Garrett, in an open street in front of several witnesses for owing him $600 in debt. King beat and kicked Garrett and held a .357 Magnum revolver to his head. Garrett never regained consciousness and died of severe head trauma on April 24th. King claimed self-defense, while the prosecution, supported by witness testimony, including that of the arresting police officer, argued that Garrett was attacked by King, with Garrett's last words being quoted as, "Don, I'll pay you the money." $600. That was the amount that Sam Garrett owed. Garrett was sickly, small, and drug-addicted. No match for King, but King was in no mood for forgiveness. Their argument turned into a brawl, and then a beating in the street outside the bar, a beating that ultimately left Garrett dead. King was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 1 to 20 years in prison. While he served his term at the Marion Correctional Institution, he began a rigorous self-education, reading everything in the prison library he could get his hands on. In typical fashion, King would later reframe his prison sentence with characteristic bravado, saying, "I didn't serve time. I made time serve me." He became widely read in literature and philosophy while incarcerated, building a vocabulary packed with quotations and malapropisms that turned him into one of the most captivating speakers in the entertainment industry. He emerged from prison in 1971 after serving just 3 years and 11 months, with a new identity, a new way of speaking, and a hunger for something bigger than the numbers racket. Within a year of his release, King made his first move into boxing. He enlisted the help of a successful singer friend, Lloyd Price, who also happened to be friends with Muhammad Ali, and proposed an exhibition bout in Cleveland to raise funds for a hospital that desperately needed cash. Despite the fact that King had never promoted a boxing match before, Ali agreed to take part. The match was such a success that King was able to use his powers of persuasion to convince Ali and his Nation of Islam managers to allow him to promote the boxer in future fights. That single charity event launched Don King's career in boxing and changed the sport forever, for better or worse. But there was a footnote to that charity match that told you everything you needed to know about the man running the show. The event raised $85,000 for the Forest City Hospital, but the hospital only received $1,500. King's usual cut, roughly 83% of the purse, was applied to the charity money. A hospital that needed funds to stay afloat got pennies, and Don King walked away with the lion's share. It was the first sign of a pattern that would repeat itself over and over again. For the next 5 decades, in 1974, King negotiated to promote a heavyweight championship fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in Zaire, popularly known as the Rumble in the Jungle. This was not just a boxing match, it was a global event, a spectacle that would redefine what a fight promotion could look like and what it could earn. King's rivals all sought to promote the bout, but King was able to secure the then-record $10 million purse through an arrangement with the government of Zaire. That purse was split: $5 million for Ali, $5 million for Foreman, and neither fighter had ever seen that kind of money before. Nobody in boxing had. Don King had arrived. The fight itself, held on October 30th, 1974, in Kinshasa, Zaire, became one of the most iconic sporting events in human history. Ali, the aging former champion, deployed his now legendary rope-a-dope strategy, absorbing Foreman's thunderous punches round after round, before stunning the world with a knockout in the 8th round. The upset sent shockwaves through sports, through culture, through Africa itself, and Don King was the man standing at the center of it all, waving an American flag, his electric hair towering above the crowd like a beacon. He had done what no black boxing promoter had ever done before. He had staged the biggest fight on the planet. Don King understood the importance of being visibly and audibly flashy to gather attention, and the importance of being on the winning side. He adopted his electric hairstyle and distinctive catchphrases to make himself central to all of the spectacles occurring in boxing, more so than even his fighters. It was from Don King that promoters started to place themselves in a visible position in interviews and face-offs. King understood the importance of never allowing opportunities to promote and grow his own brand to go to waste. He was not merely a promoter, he was becoming the star. The following year, King solidified his grip on the heavyweight division with another event that would go down in history. He promoted the third fight between Ali and Joe Frazier in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, which King dubbed the Thrilla in Manila. The fight was viewed by more than 1 million people worldwide and earned Ali $6 million. The brutality of that bout, 14 rounds of relentless, soul-crushing combat in tropical heat, cemented both Ali and Frazier as legends. It also cemented Don King as the man who held the keys to the kingdom. Aside from promoting the premier heavyweight fights of the 1970s, King was busy expanding his boxing empire. Throughout the decade, he compiled an impressive roster of fighters, many of whom would finish their careers with Hall of Fame credentials. Fighters including Larry Holmes, Wilfred Benitez, Roberto Duran, Salvador Sanchez, Wilfredo Gomez, and Alexis Arguello all fought under the Don King Productions banner. The stable was staggering, a who's who of the most dangerous men on the planet, all bound by contract to a man who had never thrown a punch in a professional ring. Soon, King gained control of most of boxing's biggest names. As the first big-name black promoter in the business, King landed most of boxing's top African-American talent. He used a combination of charisma, racial solidarity, sharp financial instincts, and the simple leverage of being the gatekeeper to the biggest purses in the sport. If you wanted to fight for a world title, chances were good that you would have to go through Don King to do it. But even in those early empire-building years, the cracks were showing. King was heavily criticized for a business strategy that resulted in his control over many of the top boxers, especially in the lucrative heavyweight division. King used a contractual clause that required a boxer who wished to challenge a fighter belonging to King to agree to be promoted by King in the future, should he win. Any fighter refusing to sign such a contract had great difficulty obtaining title fights, leading many to criticize the reign of Don King and the level of control he had over the boxing world. This was the genius of King's operation. It was self-reinforcing. Every title fight he promoted produced a winner who was contractually bound to him. Every challenger who wanted a shot at that winner had to sign over their future as well. The result was a closed loop, a monopoly that tightened with every passing year. The fighters may have been the ones bleeding in the ring, but Don King was the one who controlled the purse strings, the TV deals, the sanctioning body relationships, and the matchmaking. He was building a machine, and the machine inevitably began to chew up the very fighters who powered it. It is widely believed that King ripped off every fighter he worked with, or at the very least, the vast majority. Ali was the fighter that caused King to grow into the global icon he became. Yet despite this, King allegedly shortchanged Ali of $1.2 million from his $8 million purse in the fight against Larry Holmes. The man who had given King his start, the man whose name and charisma had opened every door that Don King walked through, was the first to be fed into the machine and left with less than he was owed. In 1977, ABC Sports and promoter Don King launched the United States Boxing Championships, a nationally televised tournament designed to identify the country's best fighters. Across multiple weight classes, the tournament was quickly exposed as a fraud. Investigative journalism revealed that at least 11 participating fighters. Several bouts were rigged to benefit King's contracted fighters, and Ring Magazine rankings, which were used to seed the tournament, had been manipulated. The entire event, broadcast on national television, was a sham. ABC canceled the tournament, and the fallout damaged Ring Magazine's credibility so severely that the WBC and WBA gained increased authority over the sport. King, as he often did, escaped the legal consequences, while associates bore the brunt of prosecution. This would become perhaps the most defining feature of Don King's career. Not just the accusations of wrongdoing, but his uncanny ability to avoid paying the full price for them. Time after time, investigations would swirl around him, indictments would be filed, lawsuits would pile up, and King would walk away relatively unscathed. In order to bolster the prestige of his tournament, King had allegedly paid Ring Magazine to falsify the track records and rankings of participants. He had corrupted one of boxing's most respected institutions to serve his own financial interests, and when the scheme collapsed, he simply moved on to the next deal, the next fight, the next opportunity. The U.S. Boxing Championship scandal should have been a career ender. For Don King, it was barely a speed bump. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, King's promotional empire only grew larger and more lucrative. His financial success continued through the decade. In 1983, he promoted 12 World Championship bouts, and by 1994, he promoted 47 such bouts. The numbers were staggering. No promoter in the history of boxing had ever operated at this scale, and the money flowing through Don King Productions was immense. He was not just promoting fights, he was orchestrating the entire economic ecosystem of professional boxing. King was larger than boxing itself. Over the years, he met with Nelson Mandela, Mikhail Gorbachev, Vladimir Putin, Leonid Brezhnev, two popes, Tony Blair, Fidel Castro, Ferdinand Marcos, and 8 U.S. presidents. He waved the American flag at every opportunity, bellowed his signature catchphrase, "Only in America," and positioned himself as the living embodiment of the American dream. A black man from the Cleveland ghetto who had killed a man, gone to prison, and emerged to become one of the most powerful figures in all of sports. It was a story that was almost too outrageous to be real. And in many ways, it was. Because behind the flag waving and the speeches and the massive purses, a growing chorus of the very fighters who made Don King rich were beginning to tell a different story. And it was a story of contracts signed under duress, money that disappeared, promises that evaporated, and careers that were manipulated for the benefit of one man and one man only. Don King has been involved in many fraud litigation cases with boxers. In 1982, he was sued by Muhammad Ali for underpaying him $1.1 million for a fight with Larry Holmes. The details of how King settled that lawsuit reveal as much about his methods as any contract clause or accounting ledger ever could. King called in an old friend of Ali's, Jeremiah Shabazz, and handed him a suitcase containing $50,000 in cash and a letter ending Ali's lawsuit against King. He asked Shabazz to visit Ali, who was in the hospital due to his failing health, get him to sign the letter, and then give Ali the $50,000. Ali signed it. The letter even gave King the right to promote any future Ali fights. Think about that for a moment. Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete on earth, the man whose name had literally launched Don King's career, was lying in a hospital bed, his body ravaged by the early stages of what would eventually be diagnosed as Parkinson's disease. And Don King sent an intermediary with a suitcase full of cash and a legal document designed to make the lawsuit go away for a fraction of what was owed. According to Shabazz, Ali was ailing by then and mumbling a lot. I guess he needed the money. Shabazz later regretted helping King. Ali's lawyer cried when he learned that Ali had ended the lawsuit without telling him. Larry Holmes, who held the heavyweight championship for 7 years under King's promotional banner, told a similar story of financial exploitation. Holmes alleged that over the course of his career, King cheated him out of $10 million in fight purses, including claiming 25% of his purses as a hidden manager. That meant King was collecting his fee as the promoter of Holmes's fights and simultaneously taking an additional cut as an undisclosed manager. A dual role that was both unethical and, in many jurisdictions, illegal. After a title bout with Jerry Cooney, Larry Holmes was shortchanged roughly $300,000 by King. Holmes eventually sued King for what he called a flagrant and fraudulent attempt to withhold money. Holmes later settled for a paltry $100,000. The settlement was pennies on the dollar, and Holmes knew it. But fighting Don King in court was itself a war of attrition. King had more lawyers, more money, and more patience than most fighters could afford. The legal process became a weapon. Drag the case out long enough, and the fighter, who needed cash now, would eventually settle for whatever crumbs King was willing to throw. Holmes distilled the experience into a single sentence that became legendary in boxing circles. After accepting $100,000 for a $300,000 lawsuit, Holmes said of King, "He looks black, lives white, and thinks green." It was a devastating summary, not just of Don King the promoter, but of Don King the man. And Holmes was far from the only one talking. Randall "Tex" Cobb, the heavyweight contender known for his iron chin and razor-sharp wit, offered his own assessment. He has screwed everybody he has ever been around. Hog, dog, or frog. It don't matter to Don. If you got a quarter, he wants the first 26 cents. That quote may have been delivered with a comedian's timing, but the math behind it was deadly serious. Cobb wasn't exaggerating, at least not by much. The pattern of King taking more than his contractually agreed upon share, padding expenses, double-dipping as both promoter and shadow manager, and deducting costs that fighters never authorized, had become so widespread that it was practically the business model of Don King Productions. Holmes himself put it even more bluntly. King's an equal opportunity dirtbag. He screws everybody. That characterization, coming from a man who had been one of King's most successful fighters and who had defended the heavyweight championship 20 times under King's banner, carried enormous weight. Holmes wasn't some disgruntled journeyman. He was a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and he was saying publicly that the man who promoted his fights was a thief. These were not anonymous allegations whispered behind closed doors. These were direct accusations made by some of the most famous athletes on the planet. Men whose names were known in every country where boxing was watched. And yet Don King continued to operate. He continued to sign fighters. He continued to stage world championship bouts. The accusations accumulated, the lawsuits multiplied, and the machine kept grinding forward. The question that haunted the sport through the 1980s and into the 1990s was simple. How did he keep getting away with it? Part of the answer lay in King's contractual structure, the self-reinforcing loop of promotional agreements that ensured fighters had nowhere else to go if they wanted to compete for titles. Part of it lay in King's formidable legal team, which could outlast and outspend any individual boxer in court. And part of it lay in the uncomfortable truth that King, for all his alleged predatory practices, did something that nobody else in boxing had done before. He made fighters, especially black fighters, rich. King turned at least 90 fighters into millionaires. He had his own perspective on the criticism. When I came into boxing, when it was more out of control, no fighters got an opportunity to fight. I came in. Everybody got an opportunity to make a living in America. That was King's defense, and it was not entirely without merit. Before Don King, the economics of boxing were overwhelmingly controlled by white promoters who often paid black fighters a fraction of what the fights generated. King changed that. He brought unprecedented purses to the sport. He staged fights in countries that had never hosted world championships, and he elevated boxing from a domestic spectacle to a global industry. But the fighters who lived through the Don King experience told a different story. They said the purses were large. Yes. But the amounts that actually reached their bank accounts were shockingly small. They said the contracts were coercive, the accounting was opaque, and the man who claimed to be their champion was, in reality, their captor. And the fighter who would tell this story louder than anyone else was a young man from Brownsville, Brooklyn, who arrived in Don King's life as the most destructive force in boxing history: Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history in 1986. And by the time he fell into Don King's orbit, he was already the most talked about athlete on the planet. King didn't discover Tyson. That credit goes to Cus D'Amato and later to managers Jim Jacobs and Bill Cayton. But when Jacobs died of leukemia in 1988 and Tyson's relationship with Cayton deteriorated, Don King was there, circling like a hawk, ready to move in. King positioned himself as a father figure, a brother, a protector. The same playbook he had used with Ali, with Holmes, with every fighter he had ever signed. Tyson was vulnerable. He was young, emotionally volatile, dealing with the loss of his mentor Cus D'Amato years earlier, and now the death of Jacobs. His marriage to actress Robin Givens was collapsing publicly. King swooped in with promises of loyalty, family, and partnership, and for a time, Tyson believed him. He trusted Don King the way a son trusts a father, and that trust, according to Tyson himself, would cost him hundreds of millions of dollars. The relationship between Tyson and King lasted roughly a decade, and during that time, Tyson fought some of the most lucrative fights in boxing history. He faced Evander Holyfield twice, Lennox Lewis, and a parade of other challengers that generated hundreds of millions in pay-per-view revenue. Through it all, Don King Productions was the promotional entity behind the fights, and Don King was the man controlling the money. Former undisputed world heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson has described King, his former promoter, as ruthless, deplorable, and greedy. In 1998, Tyson sued King for $100 million, alleging that the boxing promoter had cheated him out of millions over more than a decade. The lawsuit was later settled out of court, with Tyson receiving $14 million. $14 million. From a $100 million lawsuit. That settlement figure told the whole story. Tyson, despite being one of the highest-earning athletes in the history of sports, could not afford to fight Don King in court for the years it would take to reach a verdict. The case dragged on for 6 years before Tyson finally accepted the settlement. 6 years of legal proceedings, depositions, motions, and counter-motions. The same war of attrition that King had waged against Larry Holmes, against Tim Witherspoon, against every fighter who had ever tried to hold him accountable. The legal process was Don King's greatest weapon, and he wielded it with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him the most successful numbers banker in Cleveland 40 years earlier. Tyson's words about King, delivered in the years after the settlement, were some of the most searing public condemnations one public figure has ever made about another. Tyson called King a wretched, slimy, reptilian motherfucker, saying, "This is supposed to be my black brother, right? He's just a bad man, a real bad man. He would kill his own mother for $1. He's ruthless, he's deplorable, he's greedy, and he doesn't know how to love anybody." Mike Tyson was quoted as saying, "He did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter ever in the history of boxing." That statement was a grenade thrown at the very foundation of Don King's public identity. King had spent decades positioning himself as a champion of black athletes, a man who had broken through the racial barriers of boxing promotion to ensure that black fighters got their fair share. Tyson was saying the opposite, that King had exploited black fighters more effectively than any white promoter ever had, precisely because he used the language of racial solidarity to disarm the very people he was robbing. It was a devastating accusation, and it hit King where it hurt most, not in his wallet, but in his narrative. Don King could survive lawsuits. He could survive investigations. He could even survive the loss of his biggest client. But the charge that he was, in essence, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who used his blackness as a weapon against other black people, threatened to unravel the entire mythology he had spent a lifetime constructing. And yet, characteristically, King had a response. He once stated, "Let me write it down for you. Muhammad Ali is a multimillionaire. Larry Holmes, a multimillionaire. Mike Tyson, he sleeps on a bed of money. HBO, I made you a fortune. You love my black ass. You know why? Because I'm exciting." If you didn't have Don King, you would have to invent him. And for all of you out there saying this and that, remember this: many fighters step into the ring, but only one is still king. But the fighters kept talking, and their stories kept getting darker, more detailed, and more difficult to dismiss. The case of Tim Witherspoon stands as perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of King's operational methods, a step-by-step illustration of how the machine worked from the inside. Witherspoon was threatened with being blackballed if he did not sign exclusive contracts with King and his stepson Carl. Not permitted to have his own lawyer present, he signed 4 contracts of servitude. 1 was an exclusive promotional contract with Don King. 2 were managerial contracts with Carl King, identical except one was for show that gave Carl 33% of Witherspoon's purses, and the other gave Carl a 50% share, more than is allowed by many boxing commissions. The 4th contract was completely blank, a blank contract. Witherspoon, a heavyweight champion of the world, signed a document with nothing written on it because he was told he would never fight for a title again if he refused, and the financial devastation that followed was systematic. Witherspoon was promised $150,000 for his fight with Larry Holmes, but received only $52,750. King's son Carl took 50% of Witherspoon's purse, illegal under Nevada rules, and the WBC sanctioning fee was also deducted from Witherspoon's share. For his fight with Greg Page, Witherspoon received a net amount of $44,460 from his guaranteed purse of $250,000. King had deducted money for training expenses, sparring partners, fight and airplane tickets for his friends and family. Witherspoon was never paid a stipulated $100,000 for training expenses, and was instead billed $150 a day for using King's training camp. Carl King again received 50% of his purse, despite Don King Productions falsely claiming he had been paid only 33%. The numbers were staggering in their brazenness. HBO paid King $1,700,000 for Witherspoon to fight Frank Bruno. Witherspoon got a purse of $500,000, but received only $90,000 after King's deductions. Carl King received $275,000, so out of $1.7 million paid by HBO, the fighter, the man who actually stepped into the ring, who risked brain damage and broken bones and death, took home $90,000. King's stepson, who served as a phantom manager, took home 3 times that amount. And Don King Productions kept the rest. In 1987, Witherspoon sued King for $25 million in damages. He eventually settled for $1 million out of court. Another settlement for a fraction of what was claimed. Another fighter who ran out of money and patience before King ran out of lawyers. During the lawsuit, King froze Witherspoon out of title bouts and dragged the court case out to drain Witherspoon's prime years. Witherspoon eventually settled for $1 million, a fraction of his due and potential earnings. The Witherspoon case was not an anomaly. It was the template. Sign the fighter to an exploitative contract. Use the fighter's own contractual obligations to prevent him from fighting elsewhere. Skim from the purse through multiple layers of deductions. And if the fighter complains or sues, freeze him out. Drag the litigation through the courts for years, and eventually settle for pennies on the dollar. It was a system designed to extract maximum wealth from human beings while leaving them with minimum recourse. And Don King ran it for decades. The fighter who might have suffered the most lasting physical consequences from King's alleged manipulation was Terry Norris. In 1996, Norris sued King, alleging that King had stolen money from him and conspired with his manager to underpay him for fights. The case went to trial, But King settled out of court for $7.5 million in 2003. King also acceded to Norris's demand that the settlement be made public. The reason Norris demanded the settlement be public was simple. He wanted the world to know what Don King had done. Norris, who suffered brain damage from all the punches absorbed over the course of his career, was broke at the end of it. Despite fighting for millions in purses, a world champion, a man who had earned millions of dollars in the ring, was left penniless and brain damaged, while the man who promoted his fights lived in a mansion in South Florida. That was the human cost of the Don King machine. The Norris settlement, $7.5 million, made public at the fighter's insistence, was the largest payout King had been forced to make to that point. The difference between the amount King paid and the amount Norris claimed was stolen was the gap between justice and the reality of going to court against a man with bottomless legal resources. Norris got more than most of King's fighters ever did, and he still walked away knowing he had been robbed. And the allegations weren't limited to financial exploitation. According to one of King's fellow promoters, Don Elbaum, fighter Meldrick Taylor was promised a purse of $1.3 million, but was presented with a check for $300,000. When Taylor protested, King allegedly threatened to have him killed. Death threats. Over money that the fighter had already earned in the ring, the accusation was so extreme that King himself acknowledged the severity of it. Not by denying it, but by filing a massive defamation lawsuit years later. In 2005, King launched a $2.5 billion defamation suit against ESPN. After a documentary alleged that King had killed twice, threatened to break Larry Holmes's legs, cheated Meldrick Taylor out of $1 million, and threatened Taylor with death. The lawsuit was vintage Don King. Meet accusations of wrongdoing, not with transparency or accountability, but with overwhelming legal force. Attack the accuser. Bury the story under the weight of litigation, and hope that the public's attention moves on to something else. The ESPN documentary had laid out the case against King in devastating detail, and King's response was not to refute the specific allegations, but to claim that the documentary itself was defamatory. It was a strategy that said everything and nothing at the same time. King never denied the individual claims. He denied the right of anyone to make them publicly. It was the legal equivalent of shooting the messenger, and it was a tactic King had perfected over a lifetime in the numbers racket, in the courtroom, and in the court of public opinion. King has been the focus of a myriad of criminal investigations and has been indicted numerous times. In 1999, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation seized thousands of records from King's offices that concerned alleged payoffs by King to the president of the International Boxing Federation for the purpose of procuring more favorable rankings for King's boxers. The FBI had raided Don King Productions. Federal agents had carted out boxes of documents that allegedly detailed a system of bribery and corruption designed to rig the very rankings that determined who fought for world championships. King faced indictments on tax evasion and insurance fraud, but was never found guilty. He also denied allegations of fixing fights and rankings to ensure more of his fighters got title shots. The pattern held: accusations, investigations, indictments, and then, somehow, acquittal or dismissal. In 1998, King was acquitted of charges that he bilked Lloyd's of London out of $350,000. The jury found him not guilty on all 9 counts. Don King walked free again. In 1984, King was indicted on 23 counts of federal tax evasion in connection with alleged skimming of more than $1 million from Don King Productions. 23 counts. The case should have been a landmark prosecution. Instead, King beat it. He beat the insurance fraud charges. He beat the bribery allegations. He beat everything the federal government threw at him, and each acquittal emboldened him further, reinforcing the belief, both his own and the public's, that Don King was untouchable. King's ties to organized crime dated back to his adolescence when he worked as a numbers runner in the Cleveland projects. In 1991, Sports Illustrated reported his ties to John Gotti and Matthew "Matty the Horse" Ianniello. The article also alleged that King bribed a Cleveland judge to have his 1966 second-degree murder conviction reduced to manslaughter. The implications were staggering. that the very legal reprieve that had allowed King to emerge from prison after less than 4 years and go on to build his boxing empire had itself been obtained through corruption. According to Sports Illustrated, an undercover FBI agent had posed as a wealthy drug dealer and approached King with the hopes of laundering money through his boxing promotion company. The sting operation suggested that federal law enforcement viewed Don King Productions not merely as a sports promotion company, but as a potential vehicle for money laundering. The investigation, like so many before it, did not result in King's conviction. But the fact that it happened at all painted a picture of a man whose operations attracted the attention of the FBI for reasons that had nothing to do with boxing. The organized crime connections, the bribery allegations, the FBI raids. They formed a shadow narrative that ran parallel to King's public persona. On one side, there was Don King the Patriot, the flag waver, the man who met with popes and presidents. On the other side, there was Don King, the former numbers runner, the man who had killed twice, whose offices had been raided by the FBI, and whose fighters accused him of systematic theft. Both narratives were true, both coexisted, and that duality was what made Don King perhaps the most fascinating and infuriating figure in the history of American sports. One of the most overlooked chapters in Don King's story involves a woman named Christy Martin, who would become perhaps the most important female boxer in history. In 1993, Martin signed a promotional agreement with Don King that would put her in the international spotlight. Her first fights under that agreement would be on the undercard of the Julio Cesar Chavez versus Frankie Randall fight at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. King saw something in Martin, not just a fighter, but an opportunity. Women's boxing was a novelty at the time, and King, with his instinct for spectacle, recognized that putting a woman on a major pay-per-view card could generate headlines and attention that no men's undercard bout could match. On March 16, 1996, the fight that many credit for putting women's boxing on the sports fans' radar took place. Martin and Deirdre Gogarty fought on the Showtime pay-per-view broadcast of the Mike Tyson vs. Frank Bruno WBC Heavyweight Championship. Martin won the decision, and after that bout, she began to gain celebrity. On April 15, 1996, Martin became the first female boxer to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Martin is said to be the most successful and prominent female boxer in the United States, and the person who legitimized women's participation in the sport of boxing. And whatever else can be said about Don King, his decision to sign and promote Christy Martin was a pivotal moment in the history of women's sports. It was a rare instance where King's instinct for spectacle aligned with something genuinely transformative. But Christy Martin's story, like so many stories that intersect with Don King's world, had a darkness beneath the surface that was hidden from public view for years. Martin married her manager, James V. Jim Martin, in 1991. She later described the marriage as one of convenience and stated that her husband was emotionally and physically abusive throughout their relationship, enabling her addiction to cocaine to control her. She also claimed he used her prize money to pay for an extravagant lifestyle. In March 2010, Christy reconnected with her high school girlfriend over social media. Sometime later, she told her husband she wanted a divorce. On November 23, 2010, Christy Martin was stabbed several times and shot at least once in her torso. The attack reportedly occurred after an argument in their Apopka home. She survived. The bullet had somehow missed her vital organs. She crawled from the home, bleeding, and flagged down help. Her husband was arrested, tried, and convicted. Martin went on to become the CEO of Christy Martin Promotions and runs a charitable foundation, Christy's Chomps, that helps domestic violence survivors and their children. She is a frequent speaker around the country on domestic violence issues. Her survival and her subsequent advocacy work made her an even more significant figure than her boxing career alone had. Christy Martin's story matters in the context of Don King because it illustrates the broader ecosystem in which King operated, a world where exploitation, control, and abuse were woven into the fabric of professional boxing. King did not abuse Christy Martin. Her husband did. But King's world was one in which fighters were treated as commodities, as revenue-generating assets to be managed, manipulated, and discarded when their usefulness expired. The systemic devaluation of fighters as human beings was not unique to Don King. But nobody practiced it at his scale or with his sophistication. A biopic of Christy Martin's life, starring Sydney Sweeney, premiered in September 2025 at the Toronto International Film Festival and was released in theaters on November 7, 2025. King was featured in the film, portrayed by Chad L. Coleman. The fact that Don King's name and likeness continue to appear in films, documentaries, and cultural conversations, decades after his peak years, speaks to the indelible mark he left on the sport. Love him or hate him, you cannot tell the story of boxing without telling the story of Don King. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what sustains the mythology that King himself spent a lifetime constructing. Meanwhile, there was another side to Don King that he cultivated with equal deliberation: the philanthropist, the community man, the giver. King conducted an annual turkey giveaway each Christmas for several years, distributing 2,000 free turkeys to needy South Floridians. It was a tradition that generated positive press coverage, heartwarming photo opportunities, and a counter-narrative to the endless stream of lawsuits, accusations, and investigations that defined his professional life. Despite the controversies, King engaged in charitable activities, including his annual turkey giveaways during Thanksgiving. He also donated to educational initiatives and community organizations in Cleveland and beyond. These acts of charity were real. The turkeys were real. The families who received them were real. But the question that always lingered was whether the charity was an expression of genuine generosity or a calculated investment in public relations, a way to build goodwill that could be deployed when the next scandal hit. The answer, as with most things involving Don King, was probably both. King was a man of extraordinary contradictions, a murderer who read philosophy in prison, a fraud defendant who met with popes, a man accused of stealing from black fighters, who was also the first black promoter to bring unprecedented purses to the sport. He contained multitudes, and every attempt to reduce him to a single narrative, hero or villain, genius or crook, failed to capture the full complexity of who he was. The promoter of more than 500 world championship fights, King was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1997. The New York Times listed him among the 100 African Americans who helped shape the country's history during the 20th century. Those accolades were not given lightly, and they reflected a genuine acknowledgement that King, whatever his flaws, had fundamentally altered the landscape of professional sports promotion. He had made boxing bigger, richer, and more global than it had ever been. But the men who bled for Don King's empire never forgot what it cost them. And as King aged, as the fights he promoted grew smaller and less significant, as his roster of champions dwindled to a handful of unknowns, the voices of the boxing legends who had once been his meal tickets only grew louder and more damning. As Jack Newfield, who authored King's biography, The Life and Crimes of Don King, The Shame of Boxing in America, wrote, "The only sure thing is that, win or lose, Don King is counting the money." Newfield's book was a devastating indictment of King's career, meticulously documented and relentlessly critical. It laid out case after case of fighters who had been shortchanged, contracts that were manipulated, and accounting practices that seemed designed to obscure, rather than clarify how money flowed through Don King Productions. The book's subtitle, The Shame of Boxing in America, was itself a verdict. Newfield was not arguing that Don King was merely a bad actor within an otherwise healthy system. He was arguing that Don King was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with boxing, the living symbol of a sport that had failed to protect the athletes who put their bodies on the line. And as the years passed and more fighters came forward with their stories, that argument became increasingly difficult to refute. King's wife, Henrietta, died on December 2, 2010, at the age of 87. They had one biological daughter, Debbie, a son, Eric, an adopted son, Carl, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. Henrietta's death marked a turning point in King's personal life. She had been his constant companion for half a century, the quiet presence behind the flamboyant public persona. Without her, the man behind the electric hair and the booming voice was, for the first time, truly alone. According to court documents filed years later, King told an associate that his past controversies were behind him and that he had embraced religion after his wife's death in 2010. By working with the associate, King could clean up his past reputation. The statement was revealing. not because it suggested genuine transformation, but because it suggested that King, even in his 90s, was still thinking in terms of image management. The controversies were not something to be atoned for. They were something to be managed. The past was not something to be reckoned with. It was something to be laundered through new associations and new narratives. Whether King's turn to religion was sincere or strategic is impossible to know from the outside. But the timing, coming in the wake of his wife's death, at a point in his life when his health was declining and his empire was shrinking, suggested a man grappling, perhaps for the first time, with the consequences of the life he had led. At 94, Don King had outlived most of his contemporaries, most of his rivals, and many of the fighters he had promoted. But he had not outlived their accusations. The personal life that King maintained outside the public eye was itself a study in contradictions. He owned several luxurious properties, including a mansion in Deerfield Beach, Florida, where he currently resides. His lifestyle reflected his success, marked by opulent living and a penchant for the extravagant. The mansion in Deerfield Beach became his fortress, the place from which he continued to run what remained of Don King Productions. Even as the boxing world moved on without him, King was politically active, supporting Barack Obama in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections, while having previously made media appearances promoting George W. Bush, including attendance at the 2004 Republican National Convention. He has also been a longtime supporter of Donald Trump. The political shape-shifting was pure Don King, aligning himself with whoever held power, regardless of ideology. Because for Don King, politics was never about principles. It was about access, it was about relationships, it was about making sure that the man in the Oval Office knew his name and took his calls. His political affiliations mirrored his approach to everything else in life: strategic, transactional, and devoid of any loyalty that could not be measured in dollars or influence. He supported Democrats when Democrats were in power and Republicans when Republicans were in power. He waved the American flag regardless of which party was flying it, and he used every political connection he made as currency in the endless game of influence and access that defined his career. King was pardoned in 1983 by Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes with letters from Jesse Jackson, Coretta Scott King, George Voinovich, Art Modell, and Gabe Paul, among others, written in support. The pardon, which came just over a decade after King's release from prison, was itself a testament to the extraordinary network of relationships he had built. Civil rights leaders, politicians, sports team owners, they all wrote letters on behalf of a man who had been convicted of stomping another human being to death over $600. The pardon didn't erase what King had done to Sam Garrett, but it sent a powerful message. In America, if you are rich enough, connected enough, and bold enough, your past can be officially forgiven. The letters of support came from people who either believed in King's rehabilitation, or who saw political advantage in being associated with him, or both. Jesse Jackson's name on that list was particularly significant, given King's later claims of being a champion of Black America. The pardon allowed King to vote again, to hold public office if he chose, and to present himself to the world as a man who had paid his debt to society and been formally absolved. It was the ultimate rebranding exercise, and it worked. But for the family of Sam Garrett, the small, sickly, drug-addicted man who had been beaten to death on a Cleveland street corner because he owed Don King $600, no amount of pardons or parole hearings or letters from famous people could bring him back. His death remained the unresolved foundation upon which the entire Don King empire was built. By the early 2000s, the decline of Don King's promotional empire was unmistakable. He had promoted some of Muhammad Ali's and Mike Tyson's biggest fights, but those days were gone. Don King's boxing shows had become, by many accounts, comically sad. The question on everyone's mind was, why was he staying in the game? The roster of champions who once bore the Don King Productions banner had evaporated. The heavyweight division had moved on. The sport itself had transformed, with new promotional companies like Top Rank, Golden Boy Matchroom, and the PBC, taking control of the biggest fights and the biggest TV deals. Top Rank CEO Bob Arum, King's longtime rival, was 91 years old. Yet his promotional company was still putting out some of the most significant fights in the sport, while King was slipping into what many described as embarrassing obscurity. The contrast was painful. Arum had adapted to the changing landscape of boxing, the rise of streaming, the globalization of the sport, the emergence of new weight classes and new markets. King had not. He was still doing business the same way he had in the 1970s, relying on personal relationships, verbal agreements, and the sheer force of his personality to make deals happen. But personality was no longer enough. The sport had outgrown him. King's latest promotional efforts illustrated the monumental fall of his empire. His fight posters looked like art projects from an 8-year-old using computer software from 1995. The fighters were unknown. The venues were small, and the pay-per-view prices were insulting. It was a shadow of what Don King Productions had once been, a global powerhouse that staged fights in Zaire and Manila and Las Vegas, that featured the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, and that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Now it was a one-man operation run from a Florida mansion by a nonagenarian who refused to retire. King himself seemed aware that the end was approaching, but refused to acknowledge it. "I will slow down when I go to heaven," he said during a recent media call. It was classic Don King, defiant, grandiose, and utterly disconnected from the reality of his situation. The heaven line was a good soundbite, but it masked a deeper truth. Don King could not stop because Don King, without boxing, was nothing. The promotion of fights was not just his career, it was his identity, his reason for existing, the only thing that separated him from the numbers runner he had been on the streets of Cleveland 60 years earlier. The decline was not just professional. It was physical, financial, and legal. In September 2024, King was hospitalized for an unspecified illness that required a blood transfusion. Widespread concern for his health was prompted by a Mike Tyson media interview, where Tyson said, "You know, Don is not doing well right now. He's probably close to 100 years old. He's not doing well." The irony of Mike Tyson, the man who had once called King a wretched, slimy, reptilian motherfucker, being the one to publicly express concern for King's health, was not lost on anyone. There was something deeply human about it, and something deeply sad. The years had softened the rage, or perhaps replaced it with something more complicated. A recognition that the man who had once been your tormentor was now just an old man in a hospital bed, and that the fury you once felt no longer seemed worth carrying. The financial picture surrounding Don King in his final years was also far grimmer than his public persona suggested. In early 2025, Sports Illustrated reported on a foreclosure action involving King's headquarters. The 93-year-old boxing promoter had been named in a $5.35 million foreclosure lawsuit over the headquarters complex that Don King Productions operated out of in Deerfield Beach, Florida. There had been missing payments since August 2024, meaning the borrower had gone into default and owed $5.35 million plus interest and fees. The headquarters of Don King Productions, the nerve center of what had once been the most powerful promotional company in boxing, was facing foreclosure. King skirted that one by selling the property a few months later for more than what was owed. But the fact that it happened at all, that the man whose net worth had been estimated at $150 million was facing foreclosure on his own headquarters, suggested a financial reality that was far more precarious than the public image of wealth and success that King had cultivated for decades. Where had the money gone? Don King had earned hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of his career, perhaps billions, when the total revenue of all the fights he promoted was tallied up. The answer lay in the same place it always did: lawyers. Decades of lawsuits, settlements, legal fees, and court costs had taken their toll. The fighters King had allegedly defrauded may not have gotten what they were owed, but the lawyers on both sides had eaten well, and the lifestyle, the mansions, the entourage, the political donations, the turkey giveaways, had consumed whatever was left. And then, in January 2025, the final indignity arrived. King was named in a civil lawsuit alleging fraud over a failed bid to resurrect Rumble in the Jungle 2. As an homage to Ali's famous bout, his Florida-based production company was being sued by BYD Sports and CEO Cecil Miller, alleging fraud, defamation, breach of contract, and other allegations. Plaintiffs were seeking damages of $3 billion. $3 billion. The number was staggering, almost absurd. But the details of the complaint painted a picture that was depressingly familiar to anyone who had followed Don King's career. King had allegedly encouraged Miller to pursue a 50th anniversary matchup in Africa, which Miller did despite the lack of a formal agreement. Before the rift, King and Miller were cordial. According to court documents, King told Miller that his past controversies were behind him and that he had embraced religion after his wife's death in 2010. By working with Miller, King could clean up his past reputation. The playbook was unchanged. Find someone who believes in you, make grand promises, build their hopes up, and then, when the moment comes to actually deliver, pull the rug out from under them. King allegedly bailed when Miller asked him to help promote the event, and disavowed Miller before the events could be finalized. The lawsuit claims that King derailed the event after initially expressing interest, leaving Miller to pursue the event alone and seek damages for lost opportunities. At 93, Don King was still playing the same game he had played his entire life. The only difference was that the stakes were now measured in billions instead of millions, and the man running the con was old enough to be a great-grandfather. Miller's attorney called the lawsuit a sad day for the sport, saying, "It's confounding when you look at how many people were working on this. This is just a sad day for the sport. We are now in 2025, and there will never be a chance to do a 50th anniversary of a fight between Foreman and Ali, and to do it in Africa. The 50th anniversary of the Rumble in the Jungle, perhaps the single greatest event in the history of professional boxing, had come and gone without a proper celebration, and the lawsuit alleged that Don King was the reason why. The Rumble in the Jungle had been the event that launched King's career, the fight that transformed him from a nobody ex-con into the most powerful promoter in boxing. And now, 50 years later, the anniversary of that fight was the subject of a fraud lawsuit. The symmetry was almost too poetic to be real. The man who had built his empire on the Rumble in the Jungle was now facing the possibility of having that same fight's legacy be the instrument of his financial destruction. King pushed back against some claims in an Instagram post of a cease and desist letter, accusing Miller of falsely representing authorization from King. Even at 93, King was fighting, not in the ring, but on social media and in the courts, the two arenas where he had always been most comfortable. The American flag was gone. The electric hair had faded to white. But the combative instinct, the refusal to yield, the absolute unwillingness to admit wrongdoing, those things were still intact. As for promoting boxing, King was still at it, though neither the fighters nor the matches bore any resemblance to those during his heyday. The current state of affairs was described by observers as a far cry from the glory days. The fights King promoted in his 90s were held in small venues, broadcast on obscure platforms, and featured fighters that even hardcore boxing fans had never heard of. The World Championship bouts he managed to stage were courtesy of the WBA's widely criticized practice of creating multiple title belts at each weight class, a system that allowed fighters with marginal talent to call themselves champions, and promoters like King to slap the word championship on events that would not have qualified as main events at a local arena in the 1980s. The fact that some of these bouts were labeled championship fights was considered a travesty, and the $49.99 pay-per-view price was seen as a blatant insult to boxing fans. The fans who had grown up watching King promote Ali, Tyson, Holmes, and Holyfield were now being asked to pay $50 to watch fighters they had never heard of compete for titles that meant nothing. It was a humiliating epilogue to what had been, undeniably, one of the most consequential careers in the history of sports promotion. King was still trying to brand himself as a hero who corrupt institutions had wronged. Yes, many of the institutions King referred to contained corruption and inequalities, but his career in boxing allegedly added to the fabric of institutional immorality. After all, many of his former boxers were the ones who had leveled the most damning accusations over the years. The victimhood narrative was King's last card, and he played it with the same conviction that he had played every other card in his deck, loudly, relentlessly, and without a shred of irony. In April 2016, the city of Cleveland had named a section of Shaker Boulevard, located near King's Call and Post newspaper headquarters, Don King Way in his honor. In September 2016, the Cleveland City Council proposed that the name should instead be given to a road on Cedar Avenue. The proposal was controversial because Cedar Avenue was where King had killed Sam Garrett in 1966. The renaming was ultimately scrapped, but the boulevard section remains named after King. The Cleveland street naming debacle was, in miniature, the story of Don King's entire life, a grand gesture of recognition, immediately complicated by the inconvenient truth of what had happened on the very ground being celebrated. You could not honor Don King without also remembering Sam Garrett. You could not celebrate the empire without acknowledging the bodies buried beneath its foundation. Cleveland tried, and Cleveland failed, and the failure said more about Don King's legacy than any award or induction ceremony ever could. Longtime Cleveland resident Lee Stanbury captured the sentiment of the neighborhood when discussing the proposed street renaming, calling it inappropriate given the history of violence on that corner. The people who lived on Cedar Avenue had not forgotten what Don King had done there in 1966. They did not care about the rumble in the jungle, or the Thrilla in Manila, or the turkey giveaways. They remembered a man being beaten to death on their street, and they did not want his killer's name on their road signs. It was a reminder that no amount of money, fame, or philanthropy can erase the past for the people who lived through it. In Atlantic City, the story was different, but equally revealing. In 2006, Atlantic City named a street after Don King. This despite the fact that he was barred by the state of New Jersey from promoting in the casinos there. A city gave a man a street bearing his name while simultaneously banning him from conducting business within its borders. Only Don King could inspire that level of cognitive dissonance. The street sign was a tribute to his fame. The ban was a tribute to his reputation. And both existed simultaneously, side by side, because that was the fundamental nature of Don King, a man who could be honored and exiled at the same time. The accolades continued to accumulate even as the lawsuits piled up. Despite his disreputable business practices, King received his share of recognition for his influence on boxing. In 2013, he was inducted into the Nevada Boxing Hall of Fame. Just recently, he was inducted into the International Women's Boxing Hall of Fame, a result of his promoting Christy Martin, perhaps the most notable of female boxers. The Hall of Fame inductions, the street namings, the meetings with world leaders, they were all part of the Don King mythology, a mythology that was constructed brick by brick over decades. And that proved remarkably resistant to demolition. You could produce a library of evidence documenting King's alleged crimes and financial misdeeds, and the mythology would absorb it all without cracking, because the mythology was not built on truth or falsehood. It was built on spectacle. And spectacle, in America, is its own form of immortality. Born on August 20th, 1931, Don King is 94 years old as of 2025. And for those wondering, yes, Don King is still alive, continuing to make appearances and inspire conversations across the boxing world and beyond. He lives in South Florida, in the same mansion where he has spent the last several decades. His wife of 50 years is gone. His empire has shrunk to a shadow of what it once was. His headquarters nearly went into foreclosure. He is facing a $3 billion lawsuit, and the boxing legends who made him rich have spent years publicly calling him a thief, a fraud, and a predator. At 93 years old, legendary boxing promoter Don King had a storied career working with some of the biggest names in the sport's history, including heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. But the word storied carries a double meaning in King's case. His career is a story, yes, one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American sports. But it is also a story that has been told, retold, and contested by every person who lived through it. And the versions that the fighters tell bear little resemblance to the version that King tells about himself. The sadness of Don King at 94 is not the sadness of a man who failed. It is the sadness of a man who succeeded spectacularly at something that left a trail of wreckage behind him. A man who built the greatest promotional empire in boxing history on a foundation of contracts that fighters call extortion, accounting practices that the FBI investigated as fraud, and personal relationships that every single major fighter who worked with him eventually described as betrayal. The boxing legends who have spoken out against Don King over the decades read like a who's who of the sport. Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Larry Holmes, Tim Witherspoon, Terry Norris, Meldrick Taylor, Lennox Lewis, Felix Trinidad. King promoted some of the most prominent names in boxing, and many of these boxers sued him for allegedly defrauding them. The list is not a handful of disgruntled employees. It is a roster of Hall of Famers, world champions, and all-time greats who, independently and over a period spanning 4 decades, all arrived at the same conclusion. Don King took more than he was entitled to, and he did it through deception, coercion, and the exploitation of trust. King has been described as a mixed blessing to the sport. On one hand, he organized some of the largest purses in the history of boxing, and creatively promoted the sport and his bouts. On the other hand, his legal problems and controversial tactics reinforced the public perception of boxing as a corrupt sport. That assessment, measured and balanced as it is, may be the most damning indictment of all. Don King did not merely participate in boxing's corruption. He reinforced it, perpetuated it, and profited from it, to such a degree that his name became synonymous with it. And now, at 94, the man who once controlled the heavyweight division sits in a Florida mansion, facing a billion-dollar lawsuit, his headquarters sold to pay debts, his promotions reduced to obscurity, and his legacy defined not by the spectacular fights he staged, but by the spectacular accusations made by the fighters who fought them. Seth Abraham, the former president of HBO Sports, once said of King, "He has the most brilliant business mind I have ever encountered." Don King is formidable in his sleep. That assessment was not made out of admiration alone. It was made out of the hard-earned experience of someone who had negotiated with King and understood just how sharp and how relentless the man's mind was. The brilliance was never in question. What was in question was how that brilliance was deployed. A brilliant mind used for legitimate enterprise produces wealth that everyone can celebrate. A brilliant mind used for exploitation produces wealth that comes at someone else's expense. The fighters who sued Don King were not arguing that he was stupid. They were arguing that he was too smart for their own good, that his intelligence was weaponized against the very people who trusted him. History will not remember Don King as a source of transcendence. Rather, boxing will remember him as the man who was the true embodiment of boxing's darker, corrupt side. That verdict, delivered not by King's enemies, but by historians of the sport, carries the weight of decades of accumulated evidence. It is a verdict born of documentation, of court records, of sworn testimony, and of the consistent, repeated, corroborated accounts of dozens of fighters. And yet, there is something undeniably tragic about the way Don King's story has played out in its final chapters. The man who once boasted that only in America could someone like him rise to the top is now a cautionary tale about what happens when the people you exploit outlive their silence. The fighters who were once afraid to speak out are no longer afraid. They are old now, too. Some of them are dead, but the ones who survived have had decades to reflect on what was done to them, and they have used that time to ensure that the world knows. Mike Tyson's words delivered in that 2024 interview were perhaps the most haunting of all, not because of their anger, but because of their absence of anger. When Tyson said Don King was not doing well, there was something in his voice that sounded less like vindication and more like exhaustion. The rage was gone. What remained was a kind of weary pity, the recognition that the man who had once been the most powerful promoter in boxing was now just another old man losing his grip on the world. The battle was over, and everyone had lost. The boxing legends who exposed Don King did not destroy him. They simply told the truth, and the truth, accumulated over decades, did what no lawsuit or FBI investigation or criminal indictment had ever been able to do. It defined his legacy in terms that no amount of money or political connections could alter. Don King, at 94, is a man whose story has been written by the people he wronged. And the story they have written is one of breathtaking ambition, relentless exploitation, and the slow, inevitable reckoning that comes when the bill finally arrives. King, of course, has never accepted this verdict. He has responded to criticisms of the lawsuits by stating, "They spend their money, then they get mad at me for keeping mine." The line is quintessential Don King, glib, self-serving, and designed to shift responsibility from the man who controlled the money to the men who earned it in the ring. But the fighters know better. Larry Holmes knows better. Mike Tyson knows better. Tim Witherspoon knows better. Terry Norris, fighting through brain damage and bankruptcy, knows better. Meldrick Taylor, who was allegedly threatened with death for protesting a stolen purse, knows better. They all know better because they lived through it. And the scars, physical, financial, and psychological, are the evidence that no courtroom settlement can erase. As one commentator wrote, "I believe King's claim that he will carry on in the boxing business until he's in heaven, if that's where he's going, but his days running boxing are long gone." Thank goodness for that. That "if that's where he's going" is a sentence fragment that carries the weight of a lifetime of accumulated allegations. It is the question that has followed Don King from the streets of Cleveland to the halls of power, to the courtrooms of America, and finally to the quiet solitude of a Florida mansion at 94. Where does a man like Don King go when the show is finally over? The answer, it seems, is nowhere. Don King does not retire. Don King does not reflect. Don King does not apologize. Don King promotes fights that nobody watches, files countersuits against people who sue him, gives away turkeys at Christmas, and waves the American flag. He does these things because they are all he knows how to do, and because stopping would mean confronting the possibility that the entire edifice was built on something that cannot survive honest examination. King is now 94. He still lives in South Florida. His wife of 50 years, Henrietta, died in 2010. There are two constants to the Don King story: boxing promotion and lawsuits. Those two constants have defined his life for over half a century, and they show no signs of changing. As long as Don King draws breath, he will promote fights and he will be sued. The two activities are inseparable, twin engines that have powered his existence since the day he walked out of the Marion Correctional Institution. With a head full of philosophy and a hunger for something bigger than the numbers racket, the boxing legends who exposed Don King's sad life at 94 did not do so out of cruelty. They did so because they believed the world needed to know who this man really was, not the flag-waving patriot, not the champion of black athletes, not the genius promoter who staged the Rumble in the Jungle and the Thrilla in Manila. They told the world about the man behind the curtain. The man who killed Sam Garrett over $600 and served less than 4 years. The man who sent a suitcase of cash to Muhammad Ali's hospital room to settle a lawsuit for pennies. The man who signed Tim Witherspoon to a blank contract. The man who allegedly threatened to have Meldrick Taylor killed for asking for his own money. That is the Don King who exists in the words of the boxing legends who knew him best. And at 94, alone in South Florida, facing another billion-dollar lawsuit and another round of accusations that are indistinguishable from the ones he faced 30 years ago. Don King is living proof that you can escape justice, but you cannot escape your own story. The fighters have had their say. The courts have rendered their verdicts, some in King's favor, most settled, for fractions of what was owed. The FBI has investigated and moved on. The boxing commissions have sanctioned and turned a blind eye. The Hall of Fame committees have inducted and celebrated. The street naming committees have honored and retreated. Everyone has had their turn with Don King, and everyone has walked away with a different version of who he is. But the version that matters most is the one told by the men and women who bled in the ring so that Don King could count the money. Their version is simple, consistent, and devastating. Don King took more than he gave. He hurt the people who trusted him. And the greatest tragedy of his life is not that he was caught, but that he was never truly held accountable. At 94, Don King still waves the flag. He still shouts "Only in America" to anyone who will listen. He still promotes fights that nobody cares about, still signs contracts, still makes deals. But the auditoriums are empty now, and the fighters are unknown, and the television cameras have moved on to younger, shinier spectacles. The man who once commanded the attention of the entire world is now commanding the attention of no one, and the silence that surrounds him is the loudest indictment of all. Even at 94, Don King's legacy and influence show no signs of fading. But neither do the accusations of the men who built that legacy with their fists and their blood. Both will endure. Both will be debated, and both will be remembered long after Don King is gone. Because the story of Don King is not just a story about boxing. It is a story about America, about what it rewards, what it tolerates, what it forgives, and what it chooses to forget. The boxing legends have spoken. The record is there for anyone willing to read it, and the man at the center of it all, the man who killed twice, who went to prison, who emerged to build an empire, who was accused of stealing from nearly everyone he ever worked with, and who at 94 is still fighting. That man is still alive, still in South Florida, still insisting that he is the real victim. Only in America, indeed.